let's put our hand together to welcome Professor Harrison Roy Michael all the way from United Kingdom. 让我们一起报以热烈的掌声，欢迎我们从英国漂洋过海到新加坡来，和我们一起分享室内空气污染的重要性。有请我们的教授，掌声欢迎。
Well, thank you very much for that really wonderful introduction. I don't think I've ever been introduced in quite such an enthusiastic way before. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the International Natural Coating Society for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's a really great pleasure. Now, I'd like to put into context indoor air quality and human health. This is a very important issue. It's a very active area of research currently, and it's one that is giving a lot of concern in a policy context. So I'm going to address air pollution and health, causes of indoor air pollution, sick building syndrome, and then go on and talk a little bit about the World Health Organization guidelines, and then draw some conclusions from bringing all this together. So my starting point is the Global Burden of Disease Project. And the Global Burden of Disease Project has calculated adverse health effects internationally from a number of pollutants, but most of the work is on a pollutant referred to as ambient particulate matter, fine particles, PM2.5. And they've looked at a number of health outcomes, lower respiratory infections, trachea, bronchus and lung cancers, ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, that is stroke, and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These are all very serious conditions. And what they do is they calculate both premature deaths and what are called DALYs, disability adjusted life years, sums of years lived with disability and years lost attribute the risk factor. Now, the premature deaths are much easier to understand, and I'll present results in terms of premature deaths. Now, just to explain what is meant by PM2.5, these are very tiny particles floating in the air, and here we see expanded a human hair, and across there we get about 5 10 micrometer particles, and for each of those we get 4 2.5 micrometer particles. So about 40 of those in the diameter of a human hair. They're extremely small, they float in the atmosphere, and they deposit in the deep lungs, and they're very bad for human health. So the Global Burden of Disease Project has looked at non-communicable diseases, and they have ranked them according to risk factors. And the highest risk factor there we see is high blood pressure. Smoking comes second. I'm delighted to see this is a tobacco-free hotel, so we won't have to suffer from smoking here. And then fifth on the list, ambient particulate matter. So air pollution is the 5th most serious cause of non-communicable disease. And household air pollution is down there at number 10. So household air pollution is also ranked very highly. There are a number of pollutants there that are not considered, so this is only a partial picture. But it does mean that ambient particulate matter, air pollution, is the biggest environmental cause of non-communicable disease, which makes it very important indeed. So this is a slide from the World Health Organization, whose latest estimate is that 7 million deaths every year, approximately, are due to exposure from both outdoor and household air pollution. And that is focused very largely, but clearly not entirely, actually in the Asian region. That there are over 2 million in Southeast Asia, over 2 million in the Western Pacific region. In the Western countries, where air quality is better than in many of the Eastern countries, I say many, some of the Eastern countries do have good air quality, but many of them are very poor, the death rates are not so large, but they are nonetheless very substantial. Now, those deaths are due to a range of diseases, and we see here that 21% are due to pneumonia. So that, as you would expect, is a respiratory disease. It's a response directly to inhaling the particles. But those particles also affect the vascular system, so they affect the circulation and the blood, and as a result there are 20% of those deaths due to stroke, 34% from ischemic heart disease, that's conditions such as heart attack, heart failure, 19% from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and 7% from lung cancer. The deaths due to indoor air pollution, somewhere around 3 to 4 million, depending on which estimates one looks at, are largely the same, although the proportions are different. So we're looking at pneumonia, stroke, coronary heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer, all very serious medical conditions that will lead to a premature death. And this portrays the worst situation with indoor air pollution, household air pollution. This is a woman cooking on an unvented appliance. So she has a fire there, she's using solid fuels to heat her cooking pot, and that is the most serious cause. And that is causing about somewhere around 3 to 4 million premature deaths worldwide. Now, in addition to that, there are many deaths from less severe exposures. This is the most severe case, but clearly that is not a practice in many parts of the world, but there are other causes of indoor air pollution. And what is especially important, this slide relates more to the developed country context, is that most people spend at least 90% of their time indoors. So in that context, the quality of indoor air is hugely important. And the air pollution indoors is 2 to 5 times worse on average than it is outdoors. And that includes airborne particles, which is the PM2.5 I referred to, formaldehyde indoors, household odours and gases, ozone, mostly from outdoors, and carbon dioxide from people breathing indoors, cooking, and generally poorly ventilated buildings. So just remaining in the developed world context, this is a slide from the US Environmental Protection Agency, and they estimate that the air that's breathed indoors may be 2 to 5 times more contaminated than the air outdoors. And one of the contributors to that is building materials. So what are the sources of indoor air pollutants? Well, molds and bacteria, volatile organic compounds, summarized there as VOCs, released from furnishings and building materials, chemical fumes from paints and solvents, chemicals from cleaning products, outdoor air pollution that penetrates indoors, cigarette and tobacco smoke, animal hair and dander, dust mites, combustion gases, for example, from gas cooking, carbon monoxide, and gases including radon seeping in from the foundations. So all of these are important air pollution sources indoors. Now, additionally, a very common condition in poorly ventilated buildings is sick building syndrome. And that describes situations in which building occupants experience acute health and comfort effects that appear linked to time spent in a building, but no specific illness or cause can be identified. Most typically affecting office workers, but not solely that in any way. And this slide just shows it's not actually the building that's sick, it's the person occupying it who's suffering from sick building syndrome. And those people are suffering eye or throat irritation, headaches and dizziness, lassitude and fatigue. It's difficult for them to concentrate. They can have dry and itchy skin, difficulty in breathing, and they suffer nausea, making them feel sick. So this is very bad for productivity. And it's due to inadequate ventilation, chemical contamination from indoor sources, chemical contamination from outdoor sources, and biological contaminants. And if we just look in a little more detail at the sources, the building materials such as the ceiling are important, tobacco smoke, open stoves, so unvented heating appliances. The floor may well contain toxic chemicals such as formaldehyde. The walls can give off volatile organic compounds and other compounds from the paints. The doors may be varnished, the furniture may be varnished or have had treatments that give off chemicals. The computer will contain toxic flame retardant chemicals. And the subflooring may also be of materials that release gases. So there are a lot of potential sources there of the causes. Now, as a result of this indoor contamination, the World Health Organization has recommended air quality guidelines. And this simply asks the question, what is an air quality guideline? Well, an air quality guideline or standard is a concentration of an air pollutant below which effects on human health are expected to be zero or negligibly small at a population level. So this is not actually a safe level for everybody. It's a safe level for most people, but the most vulnerable people, the most sensitive, may well still be affected. And air quality guidelines contain a concentration and an averaging period. And for what I call irritant pollutants, pollutants that react with the respiratory system, setting up irritation, the averaging period is the time it takes for that effect to occur. For chemical carcinogens, the cancer may develop years after the exposure, and so much longer term averaging periods, typically years, annual averaging periods, are more appropriate. So how are the air quality guidelines derived? Well, this shows the World Health Organization's booklet on selected pollutants, WHO guidelines for indoor air quality. And the formulation process starts with identification of a hazard. So it's systematic research of the literature, including epidemiological studies, controlled exposure studies, occupational studies, identification of previous reviews of health effects, looking at the reasoning behind them. And essentially what this is doing is it's establishing what in scientific terms we call hazard, which is the capacity to do harm. And the next stage looks just at the exposures and the dose response from those exposures. And then we address the question of risk. So how likely are those effects to occur? And the guideline is set at a level where the risk is very, very small. So this summarizes some of that formulation process, that we look at both what are called acute effects, those are effects of short-term exposure, chronic effects, effects of long-term exposure, compounds that possibly cause cancer, probably cause cancer, or in many cases are known to cause cancer, look at the likelihood of those effects occurring, and then set a level which is going to protect the vast majority of the population. So the types of studies that are useful for setting air quality guidelines, for a small number of pollutants, it's possible to expose humans in a controlled setting and examine the effects on their bodies. Now, that's not ethically possible for many pollutants. You can't do that with chemical carcinogens. That would be ethically entirely improper. But for some of the pollutants, some that cause a bodily irritation, you can make controlled exposure studies and look at the effects. For some of these pollutants, we have studies in the general population where we can look at high pollution days and compare them with low pollution days, for example, or we can compare highly polluted cities with cities with much cleaner air, and for that, understand the exposure-response relationships. For the compounds that cause cancer, most of the information comes from occupationally exposed workers. So they're exposed to very high concentrations, and we can extrapolate downwards with the risk to lower concentrations. And then in some cases, we depend on laboratory studies using animals as a model of humans, but that's quite difficult to extrapolate to understanding effects on humans, which are quite different in many aspects of their metabolism and biochemistry from laboratory animals. So looking at this publication from the World Health Organization on selected pollutants, it covered guidelines for benzene. Benzene causes leukemia in exposed industrial workers. It will cause small numbers of leukemia in the general population. It's present in paint, solvents, and liquid fuels. Carbon monoxide at high concentrations causes asphyxiation, and at lower concentrations, heart conditions. It comes from inefficient combustion appliances. Formaldehyde causes sensory irritation. It can reduce lung function and cause cancers at high exposures. It's released from construction materials and furnishings and formed from indoor air chemistry. Naphthalene, which causes respiratory tract lesions and ultimately malignancy. It's released from paints, solvents, liquid fuels, and moth repellents. Nitrogen dioxide causes respiratory inflammation and infections. It comes from outdoors and is also generated from combustion appliances indoors. Polycyclic aromatic compounds are a group of chemical components, some of which cause cancer, and those are formed from cooking and a range of combustion processes. Radon is a radioactive element that causes cancer. It's released from soils and building materials. Trichloroethylene causes various cancers, liver and kidney cancers particularly, comes from solvents and furnishings. And tetrachloroethylene causes kidney disease and arises from solvent use and furnishings. So those are the 9 compounds that were 9 pollutants that were covered by the World Health Organization's indoor air quality guidelines. But there were also other indoor pollutants for which we have outdoor guidelines, and especially the most toxic one, airborne particles, which cause cardiorespiratory diseases. And those have a lot of indoor sources as well as the outdoor sources. Volatile organic compounds cause headaches, general lethargy, and they arise from combustion materials and furnishings. And sulfur dioxide causes worsening of asthma symptoms and arises from fuel combustion. So those are additional pollutants for which we have outdoor guidelines that can be applied also to the indoor environment. So if I pull this together as some conclusions, air pollution exposure is the largest environmental factor affecting human health and causes millions of premature deaths annually around the world. Household air pollution caused by flue-less combustion indoors is a major contributor to air pollution-related deaths and ill health. The indoor atmosphere is affected by pollutants arising both outdoors and indoors, and concentrations indoors typically exceed those out of doors. And there's a wide range of indoor sources, including solvents, personal care products, cleaning agents, release from furnishings and carpets, and from combustion materials. And indoor air pollution is a serious health concern, as most people spend at least 90% of their time in the indoor environment. And adding to that, I very much welcome the initiative from the International Natural Coating Society to try and address this issue through producing much improved building materials. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison Roy Michael.